Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan, the podcast where we like to, get into the nitty-gritty of Islamic traditions and see how they connect with our lives today. And today we're going to be diving into something pretty major, marriage. We're going to be looking at Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 5.
Yeah, this book is a treasure trove of hadith, narrations about the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and practices. It gives us a peek into the social and cultural scene of early Islamic society, like how they handled relationships and family and community life.
Right. It's like stepping back in time.
Hmm.
And one thing that really jumped out at me was, who you can't marry.
Yeah.
Like right away, Hadith 2046 and 2047 talk about adultery.
Yeah.
There's this part where a man asks the Prophet Muhammad, can I marry a woman who's known for prostitution?
Mm-hmm.
And the Prophet gets a divine revelation and says, no way.
Oh, wow.
And the Hadith goes on to say that someone who's committed adultery, even after they face the consequences, should ideally only marry someone who's also committed adultery.
That's interesting. It really shows you how much emphasis they put on keeping a certain moral standard in the community.
Right.
Imagine, right, what would happen if someone who'd been involved in adultery married someone who was seen as morally good? It could really mess up the trust and the values that they were trying to build in those early days.
Makes you think, about accountability
Hmm.
and how important it is to find partners who share your values. It's a different world from dating apps, right?
Yeah, totally different. But even today, those shared values, those are still super important.
Okay, so let's move on to another restriction on marriage. Hadiths 2050 and 2052 bring up this idea of fosterage
Right.
and how it affects who you can marry. So it says that fosterage makes bonds that are like blood relations. So you can't marry your foster siblings.
Yeah. Now, that concept might sound strange to people today, especially in places where foster care isn't that common.
Right.
But back then, these bonds were taken really seriously.
Yeah, and there's a great story in Hadith 2052. It's about Aisha, the Prophet's wife, and this guy named Efla. So Afla walks into Aisha's space, assuming it's okay because he's her foster uncle.
Oh.
But Aisha tells him, no, 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 it was your wife who nursed me, not you. And then later the Prophet confirms that because Afla himself didn't nurse her, he can be in her presence.
Wow, that's why.
It's fascinating, right? All the tiny details matter. It makes you think about how we define family today.
Yeah.
Do we give enough credit to those chosen bonds, those relationships built on shared experiences?
It's a good question. Maybe these old traditions are telling us to take another look at what we value and appreciate the connections we build, even if they're not biological.
Okay, so now let's get into some of the actual marriage practices they talk about in these hadiths. Hadith 2068 is pretty clear. The Prophet Muhammad banned temporary marriage. Now, for those who don't know, that might sound weird, but it was a thing before Islam, and even after Islam came along, some people were still doing it.
Oh, wow. I can only imagine the discussions people must have had as Islam was figuring out its own rules for marriage.
Exactly. So why was temporary marriage banned?
Well, it was seen as not having enough commitment. It didn't have the stability that a real marriage was supposed to have. And people were worried about exploitation, especially women.
Right.
They might have felt pressured into these temporary things without the same protection or rights as they'd have in a permanent marriage.
It's interesting how they address these practical concerns. It wasn't just about being religious. It was also about being fair and creating a society where people's rights are protected.
Totally. It shows that Islam isn't just about spiritual things. It's also about creating a good and fair society.
Now, another practice that was a no-go was shihar. Hadith 2070 talks about that. Basically, it's when two families swap their daughters in marriage without any dowry. And the Prophet Muhammad shut that down right away.
Yeah.
He called it exploitative.
Think about it, right? They were trading daughters like objects, totally ignoring their value as individuals. It turned marriage into just a business deal.
And this whole thing about dowry, it makes me wonder, wasn't dowry also used in some cultures to control women and their money?
Oh, absolutely.
So is this hadith maybe saying that we need to be careful about how we use dowry, making sure it doesn't become a way to control women?
It's a great point. You're right, dowry was sometimes twisted into a way to control women. But the Prophet Muhammad, by speaking out against shayar, he was basically saying that marriage should never be used to manipulate people financially.
It goes to show that we have to look at these traditions carefully. Consider what they were meant to do and how they've actually been used throughout history.
Yeah, exactly. And it also reminds us that even within religion, we need to keep talking and interpreting these teachings as the world changes around us.
Now, let's get into something super important in Islamic marriage. Consent.
Right.
Hadiths 2073, 2078, and 2080 are crystal clear about this.
Yeah.
A woman has to agree to the marriage for it to be legit. If she doesn't genuinely agree, it's not allowed.
Wow, that's really powerful, especially back then. In many cultures, women didn't have much say. But Islam, right from the beginning, recognized that women have dignity and should have a choice in who they marry.
Right. It really flips the script on what people think about women in early Islam. They weren't completely powerless.
Exactly. It's a much more complicated story than that. But of course, the hadiths also talk about the role of a guardian in marriage, and that's where things get a little trickier.
Yeah, the guardian part is interesting. What exactly does that mean?
So usually the guardian was a male relative, like the father, brother, or uncle. His job wasn't to force the woman into anything,
Okay,
but to protect her, make sure she's treated fairly.
got it.
It was about guidance and support, not pressure. It's a tough balance, right? Respecting a woman's choice, but also following the cultural norms. There's this great story in Hadith 2081 about Habiba, one of the Prophet Muhammad's wives. She was married to someone else who passed away. She was living in Abyssinia, which was ruled by a Christian king named Negus. And get this, Negus arranged her marriage to the Prophet, acting as her guardian.
Wow.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And what's really interesting is that although Negus set up the marriage, history tells us that Habiba actually agreed to it. It shows that even with a guardian, a woman's voice still mattered.
Right. It shows that we have to be careful about judging the past by today's standards. It was a different time, a different culture.
Absolutely. We have to understand the nuances, see how the past was different, but also recognize the things that are still important today, like
Yeah.
consent. It's still so relevant now as we deal with things like forced marriage and honor killings.
Hmm.
Right. And speaking of consent, Hadiths 2088, 2090, and 2091 specifically talk about virgin girls. They say that a virgin girl has to be asked about her marriage, and if she says no, her guardian can't force her.
That was pretty progressive for the time. They really wanted to protect those who were vulnerable and make sure they weren't taken advantage of, even within the system of guardianship. It's a big difference from a lot of other cultures back then where women, especially young girls, were basically treated like property.
Yeah, it really shows you how important ethics are in Islamic marriage. It's not just about the rules. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are.
Exactly. And it makes us think about how these principles apply today. How do we ensure that women, especially in cultures with arranged marriages, have a real voice and choice in their lives? It's a conversation that we need to keep having as the world keeps changing.
So we're back, digging deeper into marriage in Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 5. We've only just started to uncover all these fascinating hadiths. They give us such a glimpse into how early Islamic society worked. It's like we're time travelers, isn't it? Trying to understand how people dealt with these really personal and complex issues, all within their faith and their culture.
You got it. And it's important to remember that even if some of these practices seem strange or outdated to us now, they made sense back then. They were part of their values and beliefs.
Okay, so speaking of things that might seem a little out there, let's talk about intimacy and how people were supposed to behave in marriage.
Ah, yes. This is where things can get a little tricky. We've got personal beliefs, cultural sensitivities, and all these changing social norms to think about. So as we go through this, it's really important to be respectful of the time period these hadiths came from, and also to think critically about what they mean.
It sounds like we need to be careful. So where do we start?
Well, hadiths 2141 and 2142, they talk about a really sensitive topic, physical discipline in marriage. Now, I know this is a touchy subject for a lot of people, and it's crucial to understand the historical and cultural context here.
Okay, context is key. So what do these hadiths actually say?
One of them mentions that the Prophet Muhammad, at first he completely forbade hitting wives. But later, when Umar, a close companion of the Prophet, expressed concern that women might get too bold or disrespectful, the Prophet seemed to allow physical discipline in certain cases. And another hadith says that a man won't be questioned on Judgment Day about why he beat his wife.
I can see how some people might twist these hadiths, try to use them to justify violence against women.
Exactly. That's why we need to dig deeper and consider all the different ways scholars have interpreted them throughout history. Some scholars say that even if physical discipline was allowed in very specific situations, it was never meant to be abuse.
Right.
They say any kind of physical correction should be a last resort, only after every other way of talking and making up has failed.
And there's strict rules about it too, right? Like hitting the face is totally forbidden and you can't cause injury or try to humiliate your wife.
Precisely. Islam always emphasizes treating your spouse with kindness, respect, and compassion. These hadiths, when you look at the whole picture, should never be used to excuse domestic violence or any kind of abuse.
It reminds us that we can't just pick and choose verses or hadiths that fit our own ideas.
Mhm.
We need to understand them as a whole, what they really meant and how they were applied in the society and culture of that time.
Exactly right. And when we're dealing with these tough issues, it's always good to talk to knowledgeable scholars. Seek guidance from people who've really studied and understand these sacred texts.
Okay, so let's move on to Hadith 2153. This one talks about things you're not allowed to do when it comes to intimacy.
Right. So this hadith says you can't have sex with a pregnant woman from a previous relationship until she gives birth and finishes her postpartum period. It also forbids sex with a captive woman until she's been freed and has had a chance to purify herself.
Hmm.
This really shows how important consent is. It recognizes that women, even in tough situations, shouldn't be forced into sexual acts.
It's amazing how these hadiths cover things you wouldn't think would be part of a discussion about marriage and intimacy. It shows a real sensitivity to what women go through, even in war or captivity.
You're absolutely right. They challenge this idea that women were just seen as objects or possessions back then. Islam recognizes the dignity and autonomy of every person, no matter what their situation.
Makes you think how these principles could apply today. Like, how do we make sure that women who are refugees or victims of trafficking are treated with respect and protected?
That's a really important question. It reminds us that these old teachings aren't just relics from the past. They can guide us as we face ethical dilemmas today.
Great.
They encourage us to think about how we can live out those values of justice, compassion, and respect in every part of our lives.
Moving on, Hadith 21157 says that anal intercourse is wrong. We won't get into the details here, but it's important to acknowledge that this is part of the Islamic view of sexual behavior, which focuses on purity and the natural order of things.
And it's good to keep in mind that this rule, like others about intimacy, comes from a specific religious viewpoint and should be understood within that context. We're not saying everyone has to believe this, but it's important to respect different perspectives.
Absolutely. Every faith and culture has its own guidelines and boundaries. We have to respect those differences.
You got it. Talking and listening to each other respectfully is really important, especially when we're dealing with sensitive topics that people have strong feelings about.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the more, well, the more enjoyable parts of intimacy within marriage. Hadiths 2159 and 2161 give us some guidance on how to behave during intimate moments.
Hadith 2159 clears up a misunderstanding about a verse in the Quran.
Okay.
Some people thought that a verse about approaching one's tilth only referred to a certain position during sex, but the Hadith explains that tilth means the vagina, the place where babies are born, and that there are no restrictions on positions as long as both people agree and it's done respectfully.
So basically, it's about making sure that intimacy in marriage is based on mutual consent and enjoyment, not rigid rules.
Exactly. It's about good communication and understanding between husband and wife,
Yeah.
recognizing that intimacy is a shared experience that should bring them closer and make them happy, not something that feels forced or like an obligation.
And Hadith 2161 gives us some practical advice on how to act during menstruation.
Right.
Aisha, the Prophet's wife, tells us that even when she was menstruating, she and the Prophet would lie together under the same blanket. They wanted to stay physically close and show affection.
This hadith shows us that physical intimacy is just one part of the bond between husband and wife. It's about staying connected and showing tenderness throughout a woman's cycle. It's about understanding that a woman's body goes through these natural changes, and we should approach them with kindness and understanding, not with disgust or avoidance.
It really speaks to the Prophet Muhammad's compassion and understanding, setting a good example for husbands. He showed them how to care for and empathize with their wives, even when they can't have intercourse.
For sure. It reminds us that a good marriage is about much more than just physical intimacy. It's about building a deep emotional and spiritual connection, a bond that can handle the ups and downs of life.
So let's shift our focus to family planning and children. Hadith 2166 tackles a delicate subject. Coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method. It seems people were thinking about family planning way back then.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see what was on the minds of early Muslims.
Right?
A man came to the Prophet Muhammad worried about his slave girl getting pregnant. He asked if it was okay to withdraw during intercourse to avoid pregnancy. The Prophet replied that if Allah intends to create a life, nothing can stop it, implying that withdrawal is permissible.
That's an interesting response. It seems like it acknowledges the human desire to control reproduction, but also recognizes that ultimately God is in control.
It's a subtle balance, you know? The hadith doesn't come right out and say whether it's right or wrong. It acknowledges that people do it and leaves room for individual interpretation. It makes
Hmm.
you think about how these ideas have changed over time, especially within the different schools of Islamic thought.
It's like it opens up a bigger conversation. We start to think about how Muslims view contraception and family planning. How do these ancient teachings apply to modern debates about reproductive rights and choices in Muslim communities today?
That's a great conversation to have, and it reminds us that it's important to approach religious texts with an open mind, to be willing to discuss and learn, seeking guidance from both traditional sources and modern perspectives.
Wow, we've really gone deep, haven't we? All these hadiths from Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 5, they paint such a rich picture of marriage. It's not just a contract or a social thing. It's like a spiritual path.
Hmm.
Building a life together based on respect, understanding, and compassion.
Yeah, and what's amazing is how relevant it all still is, even though our world is so different from the time when these hadiths were first shared.
Right. It's like there's this timeless wisdom in these stories, wisdom that gets to the heart of what it means to be human, to connect with someone else, to create a family.
Definitely. There are themes here that go beyond time and culture, like that emphasis on consent. It's pretty incredible how Islam, right from the start, recognized how important a woman's dignity and agency are, especially when it comes to choosing who to marry.
Right. It challenges those stereotypes people have, that women in early Islam had no say in their lives. These hadiths show us something different.
For sure, they show that a woman's voice and her choices mattered, not just in marriage, but in life. And this idea of consent, it's not just about women either. It's about everyone having the right to make choices about their own body, their own relationships, their own life.
That's a powerful message. One we need to keep reminding people of, especially in a world where so many are still denied basic human rights.
You got it. It reminds us that fighting for justice and equality is a journey. We have to keep at it, you know? Always be ready to challenge those systems and structures that keep people down.
Another thing that keeps coming up is this idea of balance and fairness. We see it when the Prophet Muhammad talks about treating multiple wives fairly and setting reasonable dowries. Even that concept of fosterage shows how important those nurtured bonds are right alongside biological ones.
This idea of balance is so important, especially now when things feel so divided and extreme. It reminds us that there's a middle ground, a way to navigate all this complexity with grace and wisdom.
And it's not just about finding that balance between opposites. It's also about seeing how everything is connected.
Yeah.
Our spiritual lives, our relationships, our duties to the community.
Exactly. These teachings aren't just about being personally religious or finding individual happiness. They're about building a just and compassionate society where everyone has what they need and their rights are respected.
I really appreciate how the Prophet Muhammad often stressed simplicity and accessibility. Like when he encouraged reasonable dowries or acknowledged family planning methods, it seems like the focus was on making marriage and family possible for everyone, no matter how much money they had.
Yeah, it's about breaking down barriers and supporting individuals and families, making sure that marriage is a source of joy and fulfillment, not a burden because of crazy expenses or unrealistic expectations.
And let's not forget that intimacy and connection are important too, even when physical intimacy isn't allowed, like during menstruation. That hadith about the Prophet Muhammad and Aisha lying together, even when she was menstruating, it's such a beautiful example of tenderness and affection.
It reminds us that intimacy is much more than just the physical act. It's about that emotional and spiritual closeness, creating a safe space where two people can truly connect and offer each other comfort, support, and understanding.
It's about valuing that special bond between husband and wife, a bond that goes beyond the ups and downs of life, the hormonal changes, the way our bodies change over time.
Exactly. True love goes deeper than fleeting passion or superficial attraction. It's a commitment to nurturing a connection that can handle anything life throws at it and come out stronger, more resilient, and even more beautiful.
So as we wrap up this exploration of these amazing hadiths, we're left with a real sense of the wisdom and guidance they offer. They're like a roadmap for marriage and family life, reminding us about consent, respect, justice, compassion, and balance.
And while some of the specific things they talk about might seem old-fashioned or even controversial today, the principles behind them are timeless. They make us think about our own relationships, our own values, and what we want to see in the world. A world that's more just, more equal, and more compassionate.
It's been an incredible journey, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of Islam tradition. We hope these insights spark conversations, help you understand the human experience a little better, and inspire you to build relationships full of love, respect, and lasting connection. Until next time, may peace and blessings be with you.